Thank you so much for being with us today. Greetings, good morning, and good day to everyone who's listening to me. I hope you're all doing well. Um, Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host and moderator, Shaira Karimi. Today we have brilliant speakers with us, and I'm confident that we're going to have a fantastic discussions, although we're missing Mr. Durrani, and I hope he's going to join us. I'm genuinely looking forward to our discussion today and to this webinar. Um, I think before we begin, I'm just going to wait, and then before we begin, I'm going to start with some formalities and brief you about the structure of the webinar. So I'm going to start with 2-3 minutes of opening remarks, after which I'm going to introduce our distinguished guest, and we will kindly invite them to share their thoughts and perspectives by responding to some general questions and alongside their own opening remarks, about 5 to 7 minutes if possible. And after that, I will ask them a specific question, which I have constructed, taking their field of expertise into considerations. If we have extra time, I'm going to take questions from participants as well, so to make it more, kind of two-way type of conversations. So now, without further ado, let's get started. Global war on terror was once the foremost priority for the US and its allies following the September 11 attack. However, since around 2011, US foreign policy priorities have significantly shifted. What was once a central focus, dismantling terrorist organizations and preventing further attacks, has been gradually overshadowed by broader strategic concerns. In 2011, Obama, alongside Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, introduced the pivot to Asia or Indo-Pacific strategy, signaling a new direction in U.S. foreign policy. This shift was later formalized during President Trump's first term, which further reduced the emphasis on counterterrorism. Mr. Trump's America First doctrine prioritized domestic issues and scaled back military commitments and Middle East, including Afghanistan. His vision reframed America's global role, focusing on economic nationalism, strategic disengagement, and limiting U.S. military interventions and the so-called forever wars. A pivotal moment for the US Taliban Doha Agreement in February 2020 was which paved the way for the US forces' highly criticized and chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which took place under Biden's administration. This trend is likely to persist under the current Trump administration, which seems poised to once again embrace his Indo-Pacific strategy with greater attention on confronting China's growing influence and addressing European security challenges like the war in Ukraine. Today, US foreign policy focuses on broader geopolitical challenges, as we mentioned above, including Israel-Palestine conflict, technological and cybersecurity threats, global pandemic, and so forth. So these priorities raise questions about America's role in counterterrorism and global security moving forward. In this webinar, we will explore the relationship between the global war on terror and Mr. Trump's America First policy. Did his presidency mark a fundamental shift in counterterrorism, or was it a continuation of already established strategies? How did Trump's focus on reducing military commitments and prioritizing domestic interests influence or will influence US global security efforts? We are joined by distinguished experts to unpack these critical questions and examine how US foreign policy can balance counterterrorism with broader strategic challenges or geopolitical challenges. Let me introduce our distinguished guests. I don't know if Mr. Durrani joined us or not.
He's listed in the attendees for some reason. I noticed that. So he needs to be a panelist.
Okay, thank you so much for letting me know, Adam. If the technical team, can you hear us? Could you please bring Mr. Durrani? Is that maybe it's another Durrani? I don't know.
Oh,
Okay.
actually, yeah, it might be another. Sorry, I read it as Asif Durrani, but it's Asad Durrani. Never mind. My
Okay,
mistake.
let me start with the people that we already have here. Thank you so much for being with us. Honestly, we have Mr. Hussain Abdul-Hussain, who is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, focusing on the Gulf region, Yemen, and Gulf relations with Iran and Israel. Originally from Beirut, he has a degree in history and archaeology from the American University of Beirut. Mr. Hussain has worked as a reporter and managing editor at the Daily Star, covered war zones in Lebanon and Iraq, and helped manage Al Hura, Iraq. He also led the Washington Bureau of Kuwaiti Daily Al Rai. We have also with us, and we're welcoming you, Adam Weinstein. I don't know if I've pronounced it correctly or not, who's the Deputy Director of the Middle East Program at the Quincy Institute, with a focus on security and rule of law in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. A non-resident fellow at TADLab, he regularly travels to Pakistan for research. Adam's work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and War on Drugs, among others. We are also welcoming today with us Mr. Sadiq Amini, who is a non-resident fellow at ORF America. Previously, he was a program manager outreach at ORF America, and before that, he was a political assistant at the United States Embassy in Kabul and worked at Afghanistan's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York. He is a Fulbright alumni and has obtained his master's degree in diplomacy and international security from Patterson Schools of Diplomacy, University of Kentucky. He's also an Indian Council for Cultural Relations, ICCR alumni, and has obtained his bachelor's degree in political science from Christ College, Bangalore University. He speaks English, Persian, Pashto, and Urdu. I'm going to introduce Mr. Durrani as well, so maybe he's going to join us later on. Ambassador Durrani, Asif Durrani, who is a distinguished Pakistani diplomat with over 30 years of experience specializing in regional diplomacy, particularly Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. He has served as a Pakistan ambassador to UAE 2014 to 2016 and Iran 2016 to 2018, and as the special representative of Afghanistan from 2003 to 2004. Mr. Durrani holds a master's in chemistry from the University of Balochistan and another in international studies and diplomacy from SOAS University of London. He's currently a senior research fellow at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute and is widely respected for his strategic insight into Pakistan's foreign policy. So now that's we are done with that. Let's get started with our questions. So I'm going to start with you, Adam. Why have extremist groups continued to gain strength despite international counterterrorism efforts? What fundamental flaws or missteps have hindered the global fight against terrorism? If you could address this question alongside your opening remarks within 5-7 minutes, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks to your organization for including a diverse panel in terms of views, which is rare. So I appreciate that. And I don't really consider myself an expert in Afghanistan. I think there's very few experts, especially in the US and Afghanistan, and I'm not one of them, but I'll share my thoughts anyway. I think in terms of extremism, it's very, first of all, we need to distinguish between extremism and threats. It's very difficult for outside actors to manage or reduce extremism in other societies. Some extremism is violent and some isn't. And some violent extremism is outwardly oriented, such as Al-Qaeda, and some is inwardly oriented, such as, for example, sectarian groups in Pakistan or the former Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. And improved living conditions, education, avoiding real perceived grievances, that may help reduce extremism, but not always, because there's plenty of examples, at least at the individual level, of people from educated and even privileged examples becoming radicalized. And the history of Al-Qaeda, for example, is filled with that. In terms of reducing extremism, I think one of the issues with U.S. policy has been that it tries to do everything at once and it doesn't really do anything well. I'll give an example in Afghanistan. When we did the surge, um, we announced the Obama administration announced that there would be an end date to it. And so, of course, the Taliban were able to wait that out. Now, that's not really a matter of reducing extremism, but that was a matter of counterinsurgency. But because the Obama administration was trying to balance two things at once. It was trying to have a surge against the Taliban, but it was also trying to fulfill its promise to the American people that it would end wars, not increase them. And those two goals were somewhat incompatible. And so instead of making a hard decision and saying at that point, okay, we're going to deprioritize Afghanistan, or we're going to prioritize it and we're going to do a surge and we're not going to announce the end date. They tried to strike a balance, and I think that's often a problem. So we have trouble implementing coherent policies because we're trying to do too many things at once, and our domestic politics often undermines our foreign policy objectives. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good that we live in a country where our leaders have to be accountable to what the general public wants. But it makes it more difficult to craft foreign policy in the US than, say, a country like China that is relatively unaccountable to the opinions of its people. So, and of course, we have changes in administrations. I'll use another example. The JCPOA. We didn't get to see what it could or could not produce because, of course, when the Trump administration took office, they rescinded the JCPOA. So that's another barrier we have. We have changes in administrations, and then the policy changes. Yeah, I'll use another example from Afghanistan. Maybe President Biden wouldn't have withdrawn from Afghanistan had the Trump administration not negotiated the Doha deal. Of course, President Biden was a critic of the surge when he was vice president, and I don't think he prioritized the war in Afghanistan, but he might not have actually brought all the US troops home had that deal not been in place. So one administration is sort of gets their hands tied by the previous administration, and they have to think about being reelected and so forth. And this has an effect on how we approach extremism. But I guess, before I ramble on too long, I think it's always important to remember that there's limits to how much the US can really affect extremism in other societies. Ultimately, it's those societies that have to either change or not change, and outside factors contribute. Certainly, Afghanistan has been meddled with by outside powers for decades now, and that's contributed to extremism. And we saw that during the anti-Soviet jihad, and it continues to this day. But I think the takeaway should be that the United States can try to manage threats, but when it comes to reshaping societies or reducing extremism, we haven't been very effective at it.
Okay, we're gonna come back to that later on, why we weren't effective. I think you can discuss it later. Mr. Hussain, thank you for joining us today. What's your take on this issue? Have you thought that we have failed in the fight against global terrorism, and if so, why? And what key flaws or missteps do you think have hindered progress? If you could combine your thoughts on these questions and your opening remarks in 5 to 7 minutes, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Shaira. Well, quickly, my thinking is that Islamism is just a brand. I think it changes. Before Islamism, it used to be communism or socialism, or where I grew up in Iraq and Lebanon, Baathism. You have all sorts of these ideologies. They rise and fall. I think the main issue here is the structural failure of the state. State failure is what the Clinton administration was thinking of, but failed to deal with, and they just kicked the can down the road to their successors. And by the time President Bush was in power, he had to deal with state failure. So during the Clinton years, we saw that these Al Qaeda types, the Islamists, were being hosted by the Taliban in Afghanistan. They actually attacked American interests and targets, and the U.S. response was moot. We just, threw a few missiles, Tomahawk here and there, with no effect. So the point here is that, true, what you see now behaves as Islamist. They call themselves Islamist, but the same people I grew up with who call themselves Islamist, whether in Iraq today or in Lebanon, these guys used to be secular Ba'athist or secular communist. Or the reason why Islamism is being used is because it's transnational, and this transnationalism allows for foreign sponsorship. And I think foreign sponsorship here is the key. During the days of the Cold War, these communist and secular Ba'athist and all the other guys, they were being used by the Soviet Union as tools against the competing, the rival bloc, the American-led Western bloc. Now, since the Soviet Union collapsed, we have seen the rise of other powers, maybe not as big as the Soviet Union, maybe more regional. But in all the cases of Islamism that you see, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza, ISIS in Iraq, or even the Taliban in Afghanistan, all of these Islamist outfits are most of the time sponsored, directed, funded, and most importantly, used by intelligence agencies of countries that are trying to play regional politics and think they are at a disadvantage. In the case of Hezbollah and Hamas, they're clearly being used, of course, the Houthis of Yemen. They are being used by the Iranian regime. They're being used as arms. They're being used to serve the interests of the Iranian regime. And we have statements from Iranian officials in which they say, well, listen, we don't have aircraft carriers like the US does, but we do have proxies. They serve as aircraft carriers, one in Lebanon adjacent to Israel, one in Yemen that controls a vital trade route. And by the same token, I'm not an expert on Afghani affairs and Pakistani affairs, but to my mind, what we see there is a replica of the Pakistani intelligence intervening most of the time, making sure that the Afghanistan state failed in the past, fails in the present, will fail in the future, and so that they can use these quasi-state organizations, the ones that we call terrorist organizations, for different reasons, whether it's against their regional rivals, whether it's against Iran or India or the United States, or, the list is long. So what I'm trying to say here is that the model is similar, whether the Iranian intelligence or the Pakistani intelligence, or when I was a kid in Lebanon, President Assad of Syria used to do the same thing. He had his own militias in Lebanon, and he used to sponsor operations inside of Europe, whether it's kidnapping of civilian flights or other acts of that we still call terrorism. So my point here is that Islamism is a mutation of Islam, and it benefits from Islam being a transnational identity. It weaponizes Islam, and then it also benefits from the networks that Islam, like any other religion, all religions have networks of worship temples and clerics and services, and of course preachers and ideology. So it weaponizes the religion of Islam. It turns it into a mutated version, which is radical Islamism, and then this radical Islamism is used for these agencies or regional powers to blackmail big powers like the United States or anybody else, or any other regional power for that matter. So I think in the United States we have assessed that this issue is not an issue that's threatening to us as much as it used to be in the second half of the 1990s, first half of the 2000s. At the time, we assessed that these failing states are threatening our interest, hitting our embassies, hitting our aircraft carriers, our ships, kidnapping Americans. Since then, we have come to the conclusion that the global war on terror managed to reduce these threats into local or regional threats. And when they become local, they're not America's problem anymore. So, and that's why you saw all these negotiations in Doha, and that's why we're not interested anymore about what exactly happens inside of Afghanistan. I can give an example from the country where I'm from, for example, Lebanon. It has been a failing state and a mess for over 2 decades, but the American policy is to make sure that this failing state does not spill over. So as long as Lebanon is not exporting narcotics, terrorism, and refugees, then whatever happens inside of Lebanon, whoever is the ruler is fair game, whether it's Islamist Hezbollah or any other guy. So this, in short, this is my answer to why we in America and the West took a step back and let the rest of the world figure out their local problem, which is not our problem anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But I'm going to ask you one question, and then we're going to go to Mr. Amini. So these are local problems currently, but at the end of the day, history has shown, and then also we have experienced that these local problems and issues, they don't stay local. And then and that's why, because they didn't stay local, that's why the Americans, they interfered in the first, like in the 90s, or as you say, the beginning of the 2000s. So I know that we're going to discuss Trump's new foreign policy probably, and the priorities for his new foreign policy. But if these local issues don't stay local, who is there to manage this? Who's going to step in and actually, go forward and say, like, let's start a fight against the terrorism again? And but so much investment in the past, as you said, like we failed. And what are the possibility? What are the how can I say, like, how do we, whose responsibility it is to fight these groups if they don't stay local, if they spread, that we know that it's as you said, is an ideology. It's not like specific groups, it's just an ideology. And then we've seen, like, for example, in Afghanistan and other parts of the world where the spread of radicalism and extremisms being grown rapidly, even in despite the counterterrorism efforts. So who is going to take responsibility to fight counter and to deal with the terrorism in the next let's say 10-20 years? Because apparently it's not something that has finished on. It's the phenomenon that is like, we have, it's a, just because America is not dealing with it anymore, we've seen that doesn't mean that it's not there. It is still there and is growing rapidly. So who's going to step in and deal with all of this? Thank you.
Well, of course, that's a great question. I agree. I agree that this is not a local issue. I mean, I was only presenting why America stepped back. It became hard to drag all these, the American public opinion, to convince it that, listen, this will remain a problem in the long term. I agree. This is a problem. It has not vanished. It has receded a bit. And whether it's in Afghanistan or Iran or Lebanon, any other place, short of having a comprehensive solution. Now, the issue here is that Western audiences do not really have the stamina for a comprehensive solution. And what you see now is that one of the first manifestations of this problem, in whether in Syria and Lebanon or in Afghanistan and elsewhere, is that, number one, you will see a flood of refugees. So since the war on terror stopped, you have seen all these refugees jumping on boats and making their way to Europe, Australia, wherever they could get. And now Europeans mainly have found themselves that, okay, now they're fighting, or these people are coming here, and some of them are reconstituting whatever Islamism and radicalism that they had back home. The answer to this in Western countries has been a major shift to right-wing politics. They went all the way, to an extent. Sometimes it came close to being to bigotry and racism, which is not a mainstream issue in the West, I think. But I mean, this plays on the politics of why we see now the radical right rising all of a sudden in the West. How? I think it's unfortunate, but the world tends to act in reactively, not proactively. And I think sometime in the near future, there will be a big problem that the West again feels compelled to go and act, just like what happened in Israel. So Israel thought that it had Hamas. Hamas had become domesticated, and then all of a sudden, when everyone thought that Hamas had become reasonable, Hamas was still Hamas and massacred 1,200 Israelis, and it forced Israel to go back into a major operation that was unthought of on October 1 or October 6 even. So I think I hope this will not happen. I hope no major disaster will force the West to act again. But reading trends and telling from past experience, I think this might unfortunately be the case in the future and will force the West to spring back to action again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hussain. We're going to come back to this question later on as well. We're welcoming Mr. Ambassador Asif Ali Durrani. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm just going to we just started. We are taking, questions, and then we are talking about the first general questions for everyone, and we're waiting for your opening remarks and also to answer this general questions before we move on to some deeper questions and take it from there. Ambassador, I know that you just joined us, but we are talking about this, why we have failed in terms of terrorism, what happened. Could you share your perspectives on why extremist groups have managed to grow stronger despite international efforts, and what flaws or missteps have undermined counterterrorism strategies? Please, the mic is yours. Thank you. We can't hear you, Ambassador. Unfortunately, we can't hear you. We're going to come back to you until someone please fix the problem with Ambassador's mic. Mr. Amini, thank you so much for being with us in such a short notice because Ms. Hussaini couldn't join us due to her busy schedule and some unforeseen circumstances, and maybe she's going to join us later on. But we're going to come to you. In your view, what key flaws or strategic missteps in international counterterrorism have enabled extremist groups to persist and even expand? And please, if you could answer to these questions alongside your opening remarks in 5 to 7 minutes, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karimiseb. I'm glad to be on this distinguished panel. Thank you to Afghanistan's Institute for Strategic Studies for facilitating this important discussion, and glad to be joined by distinguished panelists and yourself. So I think, in my view, what we are missing out as a collective, human beings overall, is that there are certain threats, certain dangers, certain issues, certain groups, certain crimes, certain things that is a threat to everybody. It is something that you cannot ignore, no matter which nationality, which background, which type of belief you have. But I think, unfortunately, in the global landscape, it's been a norm that sometimes we are dealing with certain issues tactically. We're looking at it on operational level, and we're looking at it through a narrow lens of national interest, which in most cases have proven to be counterproductive to the national interests in the long term. And I think we're missing the big picture when we're dealing with terrorism, for example. I'll give you a few dates. For example, 1947, Pakistan was created, and a democratic president was in charge in the United States. And they allowed this to happen. I mean, what was the need to have a nation state of Pakistan being created based on an ideology that they're Muslims and they need to create a country of Muslims? Well, there were so many Muslim countries in the region, and they could easily they could work with the Pakistanis and or whoever leaders who were trying to create this country to work with Indians or to allow the Pashtuns in Pakistan, if they wanted to join Afghanistan, that they could be part of Afghanistan if they didn't want to be part of India. So there could have been different solutions, or they could have allowed other ethnic groups if they wanted to be independent. But don't create a country based on religion and then expect that that country would serve a good purpose in the global community. They did serve a tactical short-term purpose in the time that the US was dealing with the Soviet Union, but what happened in the long term and what's going to happen in the long term is something that we're missing the picture. We're looking at it tactically, we're looking at it as spans of 5 years to 10 years, but we don't look at it to see what is the repercussion beyond. I'll give you another date, 1979. The Soviet forces rolled into Afghanistan, and then the US led the Shah of Iran to collapse and led the revolutionaries, the mullahs, to take charge. Again, a democratic president was in charge in the United States, and they allowed this to happen. And they were hoping that maybe the Islamic Republic of Iran, the mullahs, would be having issues with the communists because they are extremist Muslims, so they might be of much more allied with the US as some of the terrorist groups and other extremist groups were in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They thought the Iranians would do the same, and they missed the picture that when you're giving a state to a terrorist group or a terrorist organization and they control the state, then their calculations differ in terms of how they want to engage. It's one thing when they're a group fighting to have the power in a state. It's different when they control the state machineries. And so we saw that authoritarian character of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and their leadership made them of a better ally to be connected with the Soviet Union instead of the US. And you saw how the hostages that happened and the US embassy, and you saw how Iranian has been a source of problem for the US interest and for global security since their creation. I'll give you another date, 1995, 1996, the Taliban took over Afghanistan. Again, a democratic president was in charge in the United States. And they let this happen. I mean, how could you allow the Taliban to take over a terrorist group to capture Afghanistan and then hope that that would not be a threat to you or that would not be a problem with you? And then looking at how the Al-Qaeda was active and conducting attacks from Afghanistan throughout the region, around the world. And they let it happen, and they did not have the commitment, the willingness to actually go after this group and do not allow a terrorist group to control a state or to control a large geography like Afghanistan. And so that was a mistake, and we saw that what happened there. And then again, we see that the Taliban, when the reemergence of Taliban against the ANDSF, against the coalition forces, happened after 2008, when again a democratic president is in charge in the United States, unfortunately. And then I'm going to give you another date, 2013, ISIS-K emerged in Iraq and Syria. And again, a democratic president was in charge in the United States. In 2014, there was a major exchange for one single prisoner of the United States, and they freed 5 Taliban leaders who are right now in charge in Afghanistan. And again, it was done by a democratic president of the United States. In 2009, secret negotiations between Taliban and the United States started, and that was also when the U.S. presidency was being controlled by Democrats. So unfortunately, 2021, again, we see the collapse of Afghanistan and the Taliban coming back. The first Taliban come back, a democratic president in the United States. The second Taliban come back, and again, a democratic president in the United States. Whether it's a coincidence or not, somebody has to look at these things and say, where is the problem? Or is the Democratic Party in the United States do not have the capability, do not have the mantle, do not have the logic, do not have the understanding, and do not have the heart to deal with a challenge, with a threat before it hurts the United States, before it hurts the U.S. interest in the region and around the world. And Adam mentioned about accountability, that the leadership will be accountable to what the people want. What do the people want? Every American knew that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were going to attack the United States 9/11? And if they would have known, would they have allowed President Clinton to go on doing whatever he wanted to do at the time and not pay attention to the Taliban? So the American don't put it on American public. I think they're hearing what the intellectuals are telling them. They're hearing what the experts are telling them. They're hearing what the political leadership are telling them. And if the political leadership do not take an issue seriously and downgrade it for the sake of their political consideration, because the other party has that issue and it's important for them, and so it's not important for the Democrats. That politicking, let's not put it on the American people. American people want to be secure and they want to be safe. And so the leadership, no matter who is in charge, they need to have the seriousness, they need to have the capability, they need to have the commitment to protect the U.S. And nobody was held accountable after 9/11. All of those former officials of the U.S. That downgraded the threat of the Taliban and Al Qaeda, nobody was tried, nobody was jailed, nobody was imprisoned. And again, if tomorrow something happens in the United States, none of these
Okay.
none of these officials, none of these government officials will be held accountable for the remarks saying that the terrorist threat is waning. It's not that of a problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Amini. That's very kind of you. We're going to come back to more of this later on. I don't know. I think Ambassador is still struggling with his mic.
I have a quick response if we have time while we're waiting for the ambassador.
Go on. Just very quickly, like
Very quickly. I just, I understand some of what Mr. Amini is saying, but, we have to remember Ronald Reagan hosted the Mujahideen in the White House. Donald Trump invited the Taliban to Camp David. So I really don't think it's a Republican versus a Democrat thing. I mean, we can get into policy issues, but in terms of not being able to predict events in Afghanistan, I think both parties have had a very poor record of predicting events.
Thank you so much, Adam. We're going to come back to that as well. I think in the beginning I did mention about the fact that one government starts something and the next one just like picks up from there. So Adam, let's start with you while we're waiting for Mr. Durrani. So President Obama's administration, for example, often sought dialogue with the groups or governments labeled as the so-called Islamist extremist, such as Iran, for example, and they signed a nuclear deal with, and then they tried to solve the Taliban issue trying to solve it through engagement, or they proposed that through engagement and diplomacy we can solve the Taliban issue. So the aim was to use diplomacy to foster peace and stability with the belief that engagement could reduce the risk of extremism over time. However, we just discussed that in practice, as Mr. Hussain mentioned as well, such engagements often legitimized violent actors without achieving significant behavioral changes or addressing the root causes of extremism. So, and also, for example, considering these precedents, do you believe Obama's policies of engagement and dialogue were effective in curbing extremism and terrorism in the region? And also, you proposed in your recent article, how can the West handle the Taliban, for example? Do you anticipate positive outcome after all the experiences that we had from engaging with the Taliban? And do you anticipate any positive outcomes from engaging with the Taliban in the future and addressing the broader challenges of extremism moving forward with the issue? Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a huge question. Okay, first of all, I think what countries can do is manage threats. There's some groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda that are so radical that they just can't be negotiated with in any real way. And they require a mixed strategy of confrontation and disruption, so forth. And then there are other groups like the Afghan Taliban, or maybe even Hezbollah in some cases, they're extreme, they're violent, that's without a doubt. But they may, in some cases, under certain conditions, respond to negotiations over specific issues. Now, I know it's easy for me, sitting in the US, to put the Taliban in this second category. And I know for Afghans, the Taliban are as extreme and violent as any other group. So I recognize that. But I'm speaking very, very, very narrowly. I'm talking about U.S. interests, narrow U.S. security interests here. So for the U.S., a group like the Taliban is less problematic than ISIS. Now, the Taliban may align with transnational terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda,
Sorry,
but
Adam, sorry to disturb you. I think we've lost Mr. Durrani, who was about to explain to us what was the difference between these groups. But maybe you can, like, later on or throughout your conversation, just tell us why there is a difference between the ISI and the Taliban, and what terms, like, it's okay to deal with one and then not the other.
well, the main difference between the two, I'm not an expert on terrorist groups, but the main difference from the US perspective, I think, is that the Taliban is, according to US policymakers, the Taliban is viewed as inward focused. So they want to transform Afghanistan. Yes, they may be allied with Al Qaeda. Yes, they may host Al Qaeda, but at the end of the day, the Taliban is focused on Afghanistan. And so it becomes less of a perceived threat to US policymakers than ISIS or Al Qaeda. And the second is optics. At the end of the day, the Taliban weren't cutting off the heads of US journalists, and ISIS was. And those optics hold a huge place in the imagination of Americans' minds, including US policymakers. Where ISIS, if you look at the US response to ISIS, the Obama administration didn't want to get involved. President Obama infamously called ISIS the JV team of terrorist groups. And then it really was when ISIS started beheading Americans that all of a sudden the Obama administration said, okay, well, we have to do something. And the reason they had to do something wasn't because they were afraid that ISIS was going to march on Washington. Of course, they were worried ISIS might march on Baghdad, but it was because of the optics of the situation. A sitting US president could not tolerate a terrorist group cutting off Americans' heads. And so that became a situation they absolutely had to respond to. A second reason they responded to ISIS was because there was a real before Ayatollah Sistani issued his fatwa to mobilize fighters against ISIS, there was a real concern that ISIS might actually enter Baghdad. So those are the two reasons. The reason that the U.S. will engage in sort of negotiations with Hezbollah and with the Taliban is because they're viewed more as inwardly focused or focused on one. Hezbollah is focused on Israel and focused on dominating Lebanon and keeping it a failed state, but so they can maintain their power. And the Taliban are focused on transforming Afghanistan into their emirate. But at the end of the day, does this really affect big US interests? And I think that's how US policymakers look at it. Uh, so that's one issue. So far as Iran and the Taliban go, I think they're apples and oranges. Not to say that the regime in Iran is not extreme in some ways, but Iran is a post-revolutionary regime with hybrid autocratic and democratic features. At the end of the day, it's not a democracy. It has a few democratic, but it is a regime. Let's be honest about that. But it's remained in power for over 40 years now. And the JCPOA was a multilateral effort to incentivize Iran to avoid pursuing a nuclear weapon. And I personally think it was a mistake for Trump to rip it up. I don't think the Iranians were, after 40 years in power, the regime, when I say the Iranians, I mean regime, I don't think they were sitting in Tehran saying, oh, gosh, we really need the legitimacy of the United States after we've been in power for 40 years. I think the legitimacy they have is that they've been in power for 40 years. And although there's plenty of discontent in Iran, there's no protest movement or violent movement that's been able to unseat them. So I don't think they really needed our legitimacy. The JCPOA was about arms control, and it was about nothing more than that, really. In terms of the Taliban, again, I think we could talk about legitimacy with the Taliban. I think the Taliban gets its legitimacy from their own view, their own sort of specific views of their place in the world, and I don't think they necessarily need it from the United States. I'll even say I exaggerated how much I think the Taliban value legitimacy. I'll criticize myself here. In the past, I thought that the US and Europe would have more leverage over the Taliban by promising to grant them recognition or legitimize them. And I thought that that could be used as a tool. And I was wrong about that. I don't think that the Taliban seem to value the legitimacy of the international system all that much, except that they do value public meetings and these sorts of things. That being said, it doesn't matter anymore because the second that Pompeo posed for a photo op with Mullah Baradar and that Trump invited them to Camp David, even if he later rescinded the invitation, the legitimacy train went out of the station. I mean, we've already granted them legitimacy. We negotiated with them. We sat at the table with them. We allowed them to provide security for the airport in Kabul as we were doing the evacuation. So that's already gone out the window, which takes me to my article, and I want to make sure people don't misunderstand it. The article I wrote in Foreign Policy with colleagues was based on two assumptions. Assumption one is that the U.S. ally and its allies have no interest in a renewed war effort to unseat the Taliban. And I think that's indisputable. There, no matter what anyone tells you, no matter what statements Trump's new national security advisor has made in the past, the U.S. is not, and it's certainly not Europe, and certainly not the U.S. is not interested in getting back involved in a war in Afghanistan. That's just not going to happen. I know that some Afghans hope for that in terms of challenging the Taliban, but I think it's not going to happen. And the second assumption is that there's currently no credible internal threat to the Taliban. Yes, there's the National Resistance Front. Yes, there's ISKP, which would be even worse than the Taliban. But neither of them have the ability at this moment to really challenge the Taliban's territorial control of Afghanistan. So given those two assumptions, what do we do? My belief is that the least bad option, given that reality, is to engage with the Taliban. Do I think it's going to make them less extreme? No. Do I think it's going to change their policies on women or anything else? No, certainly not in measured in years. In fact, things might even become worse. But a common theme in Afghanistan is that we don't predict events, and it could be the case that Hibatullah could have a heart attack tomorrow, or he could be in power for the next 25 years. And are we engaged in the country in a way that we could take advantage of those situations, or are we just sitting it out, issuing statements in English that nobody in Afghanistan can read, and patting ourselves on the back that, well, hey, at least we're not, even though we negotiated with them, at least we're not talking to them now, or issuing sanctions that don't really seem to affect the leadership. So I think we have to be realistic about the decisions that have been made and the options that exist today. I'm sure that there's other people on this panel who think that we absolutely shouldn't engage with the Taliban, and I understand where their views from, and I'm sympathetic to the diaspora who thinks it's a betrayal to deal with the Taliban. I understand that. I understand that mindset. But the reality is that the US isn't going back to Afghanistan militarily. So what do you do then? I think you engage with Afghanistan as it exists, and you hope that some change can occur over years. And it could be if things were different, maybe if there were a real resistance to the Taliban inside Afghanistan that was actually credible, maybe the policy would have to change. But that's not what exists today. What exists is that the Taliban have a monopoly on power. There's no real internal threat to them, and the international community doesn't want to invade Afghanistan again.
I'm sorry to disturb you, but Adam, I think there is a misunderstanding about the fact that there is no resistance. The entire population is resisting, actually. Just because they're not on the streets and fighting that doesn't mean that they're not resisting. Their silence doesn't mean that they are pro the Taliban. You know that. I mean,
Sure, I respect that, and many Iranians hate the regime, but there's a difference between discontent and being able to remove a regime from power. There's a difference between that.
My question is, like, what is the need and necessity of these engagements if the party is not changing? For example, if it had no behavioral effect, these policies or negotiations with the Taliban or with any other groups, like, for example, what is the need of these negotiations?
Well, the last time the U.S. engaged from Afghanistan in the 1990s and stopped paying attention when we got 9/11, I think the need is to sort of have an understanding of what's going on, and again, like I said, be able to take advantage of unforeseen events. Unforeseen events. In some hypothetical scenario where Hibatullah were to have a heart attack, just a hypothetical, and countries like China and Pakistan have made inroads with Sirajuddin Haqqani, but the U.S. hasn't. I mean, will the U.S. be able to take advantage of changes? I know there's plenty of Afghans who would say, well, maybe Haqqani's even worse, and he actually plays a double game, even more than the Kandahari Taliban do. Fine, but my point, what I'm really saying is that it's to be able to react to changes in Afghanistan that none of us on this panel can really predict, but that could occur. The alternative is disengagement. That's not going to really have an effect on the Taliban. There's plenty of Taliban who would be more than happy for the international community to completely disengage, stop paying attention, and just sort of issue statements in English and have no effect on them. I mean, they're already regionalizing their foreign policy. Xi Jinping handed the Taliban ambassador or received the credentials of the Taliban ambassador. So they've already been normalized in the region. The ability for the U.S. to really keep them isolated, that ability might have existed in the first year after the withdrawal, but I just don't think it exists anymore because they've already been integrated into the region. And I'm sure that Ambassador Durrani could talk more about that.
Okay, unfortunately, we don't have him here. Otherwise, he would have. Okay, Mr. Hussain, I'm just going to come back to you. Thank you so much, Adam. It appears there may be an anti-Muslim bias and ideological tendencies within the Trump administration, exemplified by the recent appointment of Mr. Gorka. Do you think there is a risk that the global fight against Islamist militancy and extremism could be overshadowed by a religious confrontation framed as a clash between so-called Christian Judeo values and the Islamic world? What steps can and should be taken to prevent such divisive conflict? Thank you.
Well, I don't think it'll be as pronounced. Maybe you'll hear a few statements here and there, but this whole thing of Christian versus Muslim, I think belongs to the last decade. I don't see it as a threat. I don't see it as something that'll shape the politics and policies of the United States or of any of our allies in Europe or anywhere else. But let me just say that listening to Adam, I almost disagree with every word that he said on this.
Even taking Mr. Gorka's perception into.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Gorka he's a known populist and agitator. I think the administration and the establishment, and I'm not taking sides here. I'm not justifying the Trump administration. I'm not saying that the Democrats are better. I'm a nonpartisan person. I only talk about policies. So, just to focus on this one person and assume that because of his ideas, things will go on a dangerous trajectory, I think is premature. Maybe it will, but I don't see it happening. Even if you compare the election campaigns of President Trump in 2016 and 2020, you'll see a big difference. He even got support of Muslims in Michigan, Muslim groups. He didn't have to rely on any populist pitches, such as blocking the Muslims from coming from certain countries. So all of this is not part of the debate anymore. It used to be part of the debate in 2016. Well, let me just go back to the discussion because I don't think engaging the Taliban or the Iran regime is worth the engagement. Engagement doesn't mean anything when the status quo, when the forces on the ground are stacked in favor of the Taliban. So the point here is that we have to decide, how do we deal with these organizations? So far, we deal with them under the Western code of whether it's human rights or whether, respecting the rules of engagement and whatnot. These guys do not care about our codes in the West. They have their own code, and I can summarize it in a few words, 3 words actually. Might is right. So whoever has the bigger gun rules Iran. It doesn't matter whether they're Islamists or not. And the same applies in the Taliban for the Taliban. Same applies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and ISIS, and these guys. So the point here is that the way we countered the Soviet Union, in addition to imposing sanctions, we had to wage a war behind the stage, the backstage. There were assassinations, there were, bombings, there were leaks, there were kidnappings. Now, if we did the same thing with the Iran regime, if Khamenei had to fear for his life, his engagement with the United States or the world would be much different. His behavior would be much different. And we see this as it happened between Israel and Hezbollah, or Israel just crushed Hezbollah in 8 weeks. And that was mainly intelligence operation, not the actual fighting force on the ground. So Israel only went six kilometers, which is less than 4 miles into the Lebanese territory, which is insignificant. But the actual win was actually taking out Nasrallah and all his leadership. So if we ever have these guys on their toes, then the kind of engagement will be different. The engagement that we have now is one of blackmail. So the Iranian regime will say, listen, either you give me the billions or I'll blow up Yemen or somewhere else. And the same applies to the Taliban. Either you give me global aid or I'll go and keep all the women out of public space. I'll go and beat everyone I see on the street. And the West, unfortunately, concedes to that. Now, the response would be, whether to the Taliban or to the Iranian regime, would be, look, you do it, you'll regret it. You don't know, we'll come after you. Our intelligence will penetrate your ranks, and you will pay a heavy price for this. Now, if this comes into, and mind you, this is something that does not really require all the hundreds of billions or all the aircraft carriers to be mobilized. Now, the thing is, since the Iraq and the Afghanistan war, the way the West thinks about war with the rogue states or rogue elements is just to send the whole military. Well, that proved to be inadequate. Now we have to think of better ways of standing up to these troublemaking guys. And to my mind, we have to go back to staying nimble, rely on intelligence, support your allies within Afghanistan or within Iran, whether financially or diplomatically, or giving them a muscle and having the other guys run for their lives too. So all of this is not part of the debate. I think the model that we have, what Adam was saying, and what we've been debating, is that okay, the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war did not bear fruit like we wanted to. They were too costly. Let's get out, cut and run, talk to these guys, see what we can do to keep things. Just put a band-aid on it. And by band-aid, I mean all what you've been listening to over the past 4 years, maybe more, but all this de-escalation and integration and voodoo terminology that don't make sense in any foreign policy that you ever hear of. Foreign policy is that you speak softly and you carry a big stick. This is foreign policies over the past half a millennium at least. So all of a sudden we come up with these, terminology that they don't really make sense. What you go to Taliban and tell them, let's de-escalate and integrate. What on earth does that mean? Just like Adam said, we issue a statement in English that no one can read in Afghanistan and Iran. So to my mind, these things are required before we move to the next steps that we want.
Thank you so much. Hello, Ambassador. At last,
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. At last,
My
we got you.
apologies. In fact, it is for the first time this has happened with me. So I feel embarrassed.
No worries at all. It's glad that you're back, and then it's good to have you. I'm just gonna ask one about a quick question from Mr. Amini, and then I'm gonna come back to you, and maybe you just gonna wrap up, and I'm gonna ask all the questions that you have to answer, and then you're gonna wrap up the webinar, if you don't mind. I'm just gonna ask Mr. Siddiqui, Mr. Amini, just one questions. Mr. Amini, what are your expectations for the new administration under President Trump, especially regarding its policies towards Afghanistan and the region? How do you anticipate the people of Afghanistan, particularly the women of Afghanistan, will convey their concerns and hopes to the incoming US leadership if the population of Afghanistan were to send a message? What critical issues would they likely highlight? Please, in 3 minutes, if that's possible, just 3 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, and I need to respond to Adam as well. I disagree with his whole thesis based on assumption. First assumption, U.S. and allies do not have the interest to engage in Afghanistan. Of course, they didn't have the interest to engage in Afghanistan in the 1990s as well, and we saw what happened. So, you're just saying that let's wait until a major attack happens on U.S. homeland or U.S. interest, and then we will be
But Sadiq,
engaging.
I think we agree on that point. Not to interrupt you, but I think we agree on the first point. I think we do have an interest to engage. I just disagree that we're going to invade Afghanistan again. So I just want to say we agree there, but sorry to interrupt you.
No problem, no problem. We shouldn't wait until a major attack happens, a major event happens, and then we will be like, okay, now it's the time to get into Afghanistan and go after these bad guys. The second assumption was that there's no credible resistance. Karim Youssef mentioned there is resistance, but also there was a credible resistance in the 1990s. There was a non-alliance that was fighting against the Taliban. That didn't prompt the U.S. to engage with them, and they waited until there was a larger scale attack. So that argument that if there is a resistance, then we'll get engaged. I think that we have saw it in the past that the U.S. didn't do that. And then saying that we're going to engage, let's see, to be involved. Of course, I don't disengage from Afghanistan, but don't engage the Taliban. Taliban is not Afghanistan. Engage with Afghan people, engage with Afghan women abroad, engage with Afghan young leaders abroad, engage with the people that are your allies. Why are you not allowing a government in exile for Afghanistan to be formed? What's the logic here? You want to be staying relevant? Work with an alternative, create an alternative. Provide the necessary ground for the resistance to do the work that they needed to do. You're restricting the resistance to fight. You're preventing the women leaders to voice out their opinion. You created the Taliban office. Why are you not creating an office for Afghan women? What is the law? You want to be engaged? Don't send millions of dollars to the Taliban. I think what you're trying to do is replicating what has happened in the past. There's nothing new. I don't see anything new in the template of US with the Taliban. And it's exactly following the same template that the US did with Iran. What did you get out of negotiating with Iranians for 4 years? What have you gotten anything from the Iranian for 4 years? You're going to do the same thing with the Taliban. Don't do it, please. You don't have anything new to offer. Listen to Afghans. The Taliban is a terrorist group. They have allowed all of the terrorist groups to operate in Afghanistan, and you are saying it, I'm saying it, they're in the hands of the IRGC of Iran, they're in the hands of the CCP of China, they're in the hands of the FSP of Russia, and they're in the hands of elements of the ISI, the same elements who allowed Al-Qaeda leader to live in Pakistan for years. So all of your enemies have combined their efforts and they created the Taliban. They supported and financed the Taliban. They trained the Taliban to come and negotiate with you, to speak with you, to get their prisoners out, to create to do the negotiations and tactics and everything, and eventually forced you out of Afghanistan. You think you got out of Afghanistan. You didn't get out of Afghanistan. The plan to zero was not on the table of the US leadership in the Republican administration, and it wasn't in the Democratic leadership. It was forced upon you. So if you have been defeated by the intelligence agencies in the region, and Taliban is their proxy group, why do you think you being engaged there that will create for them to break away? They will stab you again from the back. They did it in the past. They will do it again. This time they will do it much more seriously because you are in a great power competition and you're missing the point. The Chinese and Russians are not willing to fight you in front of face to face. They're going to do asymmetric warfare, and asymmetric warfare is hitting Israel the way they did that nobody detected. Where were all of these U.S. entities and so many Five Eyes and intelligence agencies? Why they couldn't detect a small terrorist group like Hamas to do an attack on Israel? If Israel could not do that, and if you couldn't do it, then what are terrorist groups are cooking right now against Europe and against the US that you're not seeing, that you're not detecting? And you're going to wait until that happens, saying that, oh, now it's the time for the terrorists to be a serious issue. When it happens, then what's the point? It's already happened. So I think for Trump administration, I would say they need to take a harder look, saying that the Chinese and the Russians and Iranians, they know they cannot take on Israel and they cannot take on the US in direct confrontation. They're going to go towards asymmetric warfare. And one of the ways is following the footstep of the US as they dealt with the Soviet Union. You used all of the non-state actors. You used all of the terrorist groups against the Soviet Union. All of the same terrorist groups are right now in the hands and pockets of the Chinese, and they're going to use it against you. They're not going to wait for you to come after the China from the eastern side, the Indo-Pacific side, and direct military confrontation. I know it's hard for Democrats to think non-state actor type. Maybe it's very difficult, put it in a state context, but the Chinese are not going to do it. They're going to use a terrorist group to come after you, and they have already created ISSK in Afghanistan. Look at it. There's nothing there to indicate that ISSK is a group that some Afghans or some Taliban believe in. It's a made-up group so that the Taliban could hide their hands when they attack you. And they've already attacked Europe. They've already infiltrated in the US. And if you have arrested a few of them in the United States, imagine how many other networks and cells are already in the United States that you are yet to detect. And so all of them are Taliban, all of them are ISSK. They will come after you, stop your engagement, cut off your relationship, don't engage with Taliban. If you want to be staying relevant and if you want to stay constructive and you want to stay to be ready for a change that's going to happen, work with Afghans who are going to be the change. Work with the future generation of Afghans. Work with the Afghan women. How dare you advocating engagement with a group that has imprisoned more than 20 million Afghan women and girls? Are those women not human beings?
Mr. Amini, thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're going to come back if we have time. Thank you so much. Ambassador, thank you for being with us at last. It's a pleasure to have you. Could you please, I'm just going to let you start with your own opening remarks and what do you think about this whole thing? And then we're going to come back to your specific questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My apologies for this technical hiccup. The theme is quite tempting as well as discouraging. I think that this so-called global war on terrorism began with 9/11 and ended with the US withdrawal. Now you can make your own judgments. This is the short answer I can give you. And what is left now is the remnant of war on terror, which is to be cleared by the countries of the region, whether we like it or not. Al-Qaeda has almost been decimated. ISKP is not considered as a global threat as far as our American friends are concerned. So Ukraine and Gaza wars have, in fact, deviated everything. And the priorities are different. So Afghanistan is on the least priority. Again, we like it or not. I've been speaking to some of my American friends, and I said on a scale of 10, where does Afghanistan stand? And without blinking their eyes, they said 2, rather less than 2. Again, whether we like it or not. This is the priority. The United States chose, while in the thick of the war, when they decimated, when they deposed Taliban, they diverted their attention to Iraq. No one told them, please first consolidate your position in Afghanistan, and then you can talk about Iraq. Well, as all we know that war in Afghanistan was a necessity, but war in Iraq was a war of choice. So they choose to go to Iraq. And again, Afghanistan was relegated to the background. So therefore, when withdrawal came, so there was a bipartisan support from the Republicans and Democrats. A Republican President Trump signed the agreement at Doha, and Mr. Biden implemented. Now, if we want to criticize Mr. Biden, that is only a matter of rhetoric and only a matter of debate. We want to pin blame on A, B, C, or X, Y, Z, that you can do. But facts are facts. And facts are that Taliban are a reality, which the US leadership accepts that they are a reality. Again, we like it or not. And when it comes to Taliban rule, even the American analysts say that they are under no threat at the moment. Secondly, the opposition is not in a position at the moment to dislodge the Taliban. Let me repeat, at the moment, because we are talking about Afghanistan, things can change. Things can change, and no one is for sure whether Taliban will stay next year or the year after. But we are talking about the situation on 26 November 2024. But at the same time, there are stark realities. And Taliban rule is synonymous with poverty, whether Taliban 1.0 or 2.0. The poverty graph goes up. Right now, the poverty, as per the UN estimates, is 97%, out of which 52% population is dependent on international humanitarian assistance. And that has to be addressed. The United States claimed to be the largest donor, but overall international assistance has dwindled to 1/3. So last year, out of $4.2 billion pledges, only 1/3 were met. This year, only 25% has been met. So these are also the stark realities. We have to look into that. Now, by and large, Afghanistan has to be dealt by the regional countries. Its immediate neighbors, Russia and India, and then Turkey to some extent. Even the Gulf states are not that much interested, except for Qatar, which is playing the role of facilitator, not more than that. But here I have to flag warning that ignoring Afghanistan will be a mistake. Such a negligence caused 9/11, and a similar policy may cause another 9/11. I have been repeatedly saying that come to Afghanistan, otherwise Afghanistan will come to you. So this is something has to be taken serious note of. And what to do? Almost half of the Afghan population has been totally paralyzed, women population. And I asked some of the Taliban ministers recently. Recently means I just quit my job 2 months ago. Before that what are you going to do with your women after 10 or 20 years? Will you be showing them to male doctors? And they had no answer, and they were in fact beating about the bush. So these are certain, again, unfortunate stark realities which Afghanistan is facing. And it's only the Afghans who can remedy the situation. No one else. Outsiders can't do that. And whenever they tried, they have burnt their fingers. So I think, but you have to engage with them. Otherwise, the fear is that the poverty graph, if it goes more, then people will start leaving the country. And from Pakistan's perspective, Pakistan is the first port of call because they don't go, Afghans don't go anywhere else, even not in Iran. The first priority is Pakistan. So for Pakistan, this is. And what can be done? It is to unfreeze Afghan accounts, which is close to $9 billion. Plus, the Afghan banks should be allowed to do business. But as far as Trump's likely policy, I have no doubt that his America First policy would dominate the scene. So therefore, again, Afghanistan would not be a priority. And the countries of the region will have to fend for Afghanistan. And we should not expect much about that, that perhaps there'll be a change of heart in the Trump administration. And as I said, Afghanistan is not a priority, so therefore, only to the extent of giving humanitarian assistance is the likelihood, not more, not less. This is what I think is going to be the case. Counterterrorism would be just superficial, what is being done. As I said, that for the United States, war on terror has been won, and with the withdrawal of the American troops. I hardly hear any statement as far as war on terror is concerned in the American administration. I stand corrected.
Okay, thank you so much. Ambassador, we were talking about
just two sentences.
Oh, yeah.
The United Nations system is almost paralyzed because of the American and the Western attitude. So the Doha process is not moving much except for rhetorics. And Moscow format, yes, that is about the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, Russia, India. They are making it active, but although no major breakthroughs are expected for the time. So this is what I can say. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Ambassador, I mean, we were talking about the engagement, and also you've mentioned that we have to engage with the Taliban as well. But there was using your profound knowledge and expertise in this field, could you explain why there are different perspectives on the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, and why with the former is, you know, engagement is possible, and with the latter is impossible, and also tell us about your experience about, you know, talking with the Pakistani Taliban, who are considered terrorists still, and with the Afghan Taliban, who are, you know, being kind of considered as good terrorists, or you know, just explain this situation, and why is it possible to engage with the Afghan Taliban and not the Pakistani Taliban, and why one is considered a terrorist group and the other, you know, just a kind of a moderate or Islamist group, or that can be you know, managed or something. Please explain that situation. Thank you.
I have issues with the term terrorist. These are the opposition people. These TTP were telling Musharraf, President General Musharraf, that till yesterday we were Mujahideen. It is you who had taken the U-turn after the 9/11. We are the same people. So this is not neither a good Taliban or bad Taliban. I don't know who was that idiot who coined this term. I don't subscribe to that. It's opposition. It is the power play. It's a struggle for power. They want to have power because in Pakistan side, when federally administered tribal areas were merged after a constitutional amendment, the TTP got more active, and that's how they were launching their attacks. And with the withdrawal of the American troops, they found Afghanistan as a better sanctuary to launch their attacks. But for Pakistan, it's a return. It's not a big threat. I think Pakistan can meet those threats. Of course, it will take a while. But with the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, our ask is that at least make them, at least disarm them. Like other Afghans, you have disarmed other Afghans. So this is what we are, I mean, as far as I can observe and I can say. This can be tackled, and it's being tackled. It will be tackled. This much I'm sure, I'm confident.
Okay, thank you so much. If you could conclude, starting with Mr. Hussain, if you could you know, give us your concluding remarks, and also just give us a little bit of maybe and 2 minutes. Also, if that's possible, we're running out of time. If that's possible, to explain what would be like just short priorities for the Trump's administration in terms of foreign policy, for example, and also just you know, give us your concluding remarks. Thank you so much.
Sure. Well, number one, even if we leave the world will not leave us. So we have to remain engaged. And number two, if the previous models of sending the whole military to invade countries wholesale did not work, it does not mean that this is the only model through which we can use our levers of power. And number three, I think it's time that we snap out of the Afghanistan and Iraq war hangovers and try to think smartly again of how to apply the classic foreign policy of carry a big stick and speak softly. That's it. Thanks.
Adam, same question applies to you. Thank you so much. And
well, thanks to my fellow panelists. It's been interesting, and they've made some provocative points and some challenging points. I actually agree with Sadiq that we probably should have an office for Afghan women. We do have Rina Amiri, who's a special representative, but perhaps we should have an office. There's things I don't think we should do. I don't think the US is good at creating governments in exile, and I don't think disengagement is the right answer, and I don't think we can really dislodge the Taliban militarily without repeating the mistakes of GWOT. So when I speak about engagement with the Taliban, I mean a sort of engagement that allows us to be reactive and to not disengage the way we did in the 90s. And that's speaking from a very narrow view of US interests. It's not about human rights or anything like that, because I don't think that's what drives US foreign policy. In terms of transformational change in Afghanistan, I do hope for the Afghan people that there can be transformational change, but I agree with Ambassador Durrani that that has to come from Afghans, and ultimately it will fall on Afghans, and to a large extent Afghan men who are in a position of privilege in some ways to change inside Afghanistan. And of course, I take your point about I take the moderator's point about Miss Karimi about the fact that Afghans are resisting and are probably not okay with what the Taliban are doing. But for there to be transformational change, that discontent is going to have to lead to something more substantial. And I think perhaps if when that happens, there will have to if that happens, there will have to be a reassessment of U.S. and European policies. But for now, I do stand by my position that the only way forward is in engagement, although I do hope that there can be transformational change someday. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Durrani, what would be the priorities of the US, and also your concluding remarks? It's so sad that we didn't have a time to have more conversations with you, but what do you think would be the priorities in terms of counterterrorism for Trump? And also your concluding remarks, please. Thank you.
As I said in my initial remarks, there's no more terrorism or counterterrorism. They'll only react. For them, so-called war on terror is over. Whether we can debate that, but as far as the American administration is concerned, it's no more. It's not being discussed. I don't know. And then that's why then the 1267 committee is in a limbo right now. And then mind you, the Afghan Taliban are not declared as terrorists, as was the Al-Qaeda. They separated the 1267 committee into 1988 Taliban committee. And there were certain people who were designated as people to be tried, but the rest of the Taliban were doing their business. And then it was the United States, which shook hands with the same Taliban to whom they used to call them terrorists, but they shook hands with them. So, and while Mr. Ashraf Ghani's government was still there, so they over the heads and shoulders of Ashraf Ghani government, United States signed the agreement smilingly, with smile faces. They shook hands and then they left. So it's not in priority, as I say, and it's not going to be a priority. Although I'm concerned with this sort of, Afghanistan relegated in the priority list at the bottom, because as I said earlier, they can cause problems. Because if the past 45 years of Afghan history is a guide, things are unstable, things are not good, and there are deep divides among the Afghan factions. So there's a need to bring, and that can, again, at the cost of repeating myself, it all depends on the Afghans, whether they want unity or not.
Okay.
So without Afghan unity, no one can do anything.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Mr. Amini, 2 minutes, your final remarks. Thank you.
Sure. I think I fully agree that it's up to Afghans, and Afghans will rise up against the Taliban, and they will topple this regime if the U.S. and international community, the regional powers, stop engaging with the Taliban, stop sending funds to the Taliban, stop providing platforms to the Taliban, stop giving them a sense of legitimacy or indicating that they don't need legitimacy or that they are in need with us. And don't negotiate with them. Don't let them take hostages and then come to you and then negotiate. And then based on those tactical negotiations, you realize that you were talking with some mullah and maybe they could be useful to you, but down the road they will blow themselves up when they are hugging you. So I think that that's a mistake that people need to realize. They have done it with Iran for 40 years. The regime did not change because they did not allow the opposition to breathe anywhere by engaging the regime, and they're trying to do the same thing with the Taliban. They should stop it. It's wrong. It's a mistake. You cannot engage with a group that is terrorizing more than 40 million population and has imprisoned more than 20 million women and girls, and then expect that there will be some change down the road. And I think Mr. Durrani is asleep. He needs to be awake, with all due respect, that the Taliban is as an opposition. There's no opposition. You cannot have a political opposition in any country advocating for the imprisonment of half of the population that are women. That is not a political opposition. That is terrorism, plain and sight. And the fact that the U.S. leadership, or there is no terrorism or counterterrorism, it's all, I think, the U.S. entities and U.S. experts and media and intellectuals are only responding to what the U.S. leadership's focus is at a time. And if they're focusing on China, everybody focuses on China. And if they're focusing on Russia, they're focusing on China. And if they're focusing on Taliban, they're focusing there. They do not have the initiative to put the issues on the table and make them a priority, indicating that terrorism threat has always been there. They will always remain. And right now, they are aligned with your enemies in the greater power competition, and they're working alongside with your enemies, and you need to deal with them. Do not allow their proxy regimes to control Afghanistan, and do not allow them. If you allow Taliban to take over Afghanistan, you should have expected that they would have gone after Israel. And right now, Iran is daringly sending missiles attacking Israel. That's not terrorism. That's IRGC, a terrorist group. And they're attacking Israel in broad daylight. They're threatening that they will attack Israel. And the world is just watching in silence and is still trying to see if they can engage with Iranian officials. Don't engage with terrorists. Don't engage with murderers. Don't engage with pedophiles. Don't engage with rapists. That's looked bad on you. It reflects negatively on you. You're better than that. Engage with the righteous people. Engage with the good people. Engage with those who you think they do not have the power. Engage with them, empower them. You have the power, you have the money, you have the political resources. Allow the opposition to become a serious force in Afghanistan. Why are you not doing it? So work to change, to bring the change in Afghanistan. Work to freedom, to bring freedom in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Amini. Thank you so much for all our guests, and it was a pleasure and honor to have you. And it was a very productive conversation. Unfortunately, we can't take it more questions from the participants, and also it's very interesting. And maybe we should, have a part 2 or something. It's a very interesting conversation. So thank you so much for being with us. I wish you all a lovely time, and speak to you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.